Hello and welcome back to As We May Think. This is, I won't say it's the last one that I'll ever do for LitElement, but this is hopefully kind of a wrap-up for LitElement and talking about how it relates to web components. After all, LitElement is just one library, but it's a very good one. Today we're going to talk about events, lifecycle, and then do a quick wrap-up about the things I haven't talked about, specifically things like Shadow DOM and whatnot. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but let's talk about events, because anytime you're bringing data in via attributes and via setting values, properties on a given component, that's great for getting data in, but how do you get stuff back out? How do you notify the HTML page that your component has had something happen? Or how do you notify components above your component? If you're nesting a bunch of components, how do you let them know that something has happened? Events is the mechanism for that. And there's two kinds of ways to wire up to receive events. There's what you see in the top portion of this one and what you see in the bottom portion of this one. And the difference really matters at the boundary of the component. So when you're doing a custom component, if it's going to use other components inside of it, or it's going to embed other custom components inside of it, the templating mechanism for LitElement makes it very easy to wire up for those events. All you have to do is say @ and the name of the custom event. So that can be a multi-word event if you want to, and as long as you say this and this, then you're basically saying here is now the function to call when this event happens. And so on your class, you would put a function like this one, load complete, matches to this right here. And when this event happens on the component that you are wrapping, and you can do the same things for like click and other kinds of events, change and whatnot, then when that happens, this function will get called and it'll get past the event object. And the event object looks just like the standard event object you normally get in HTML. Because remember, this is all just regular HTML. So when that happens, then you could do something like console log something out or react in some way, whatever it is you need to do. In this case, I'm getting the event, I'm getting the details inside it, and specifically I'm getting the message inside of that. Now, if this was an event I was trying to push up to outside of all of my components, say I have a component that is on that I expect other users to use my component and they aren't necessarily using LitHTML or LitElement, in those cases, they need to wire up to my custom event, if I have a custom event, via add event listener, the same way you would normally in JavaScript listen for custom events. They give the name of it, and here's the function that gets called. So it's still just as easy for them to access the event as if it was any other kind of component built into HTML. So here's how that event actually got created. Someplace inside of my component, I create a new custom event. I give it the event name. You'll notice that's the exact same one that everybody was watching for outside, whether they were regular JavaScript code that was trying to watch for an event on my component, or it was LitElement binding to it. In this case, you'll notice that I've got a detail, and I've attached a message directly onto that so that it can be sent up to the parent. The detail can be anything. It can just be a JSON object with as much information as you want to pass up with your event. In this case, I've marked it as bubbles true. There's a couple of reasons to do that. One is if it really is an event that needs to bubble up, that it might be captured by higher levels of code, you might need bubbles on it. And also, if you're using it within Storybook, if you expect the action, they have a plugin specifically for watching for events from your components. If you have action and you want to see the events happen, you have to have bubbles true on there. And then you just dispatch that event. So this would be inside your code to emit an event whenever something happened inside your code. With these two little bits of how to bind to an event and then how to emit that event, that's really event handling for the most part within LitElement. There's really not a lot more to it. And in fact, what you're going to see is they're kind of just using the basic, other than the binding thing which they offer, it's pretty much the standard event mechanisms that are provided by HTML anyway and JavaScript. So it's not really unusual. Anything you read about this stuff, it's going to all make a lot of sense. You might, under some circumstances, need another parameter called composed true to indicate that you want your event to bubble up. You don't want it to accidentally stop at the boundary of your component. Like, let's say you've got you want an event from a wrapped component to make it all the way outside of your component. That won't normally happen, so you might also have to use composed true. But there's really not a lot to this. It's pretty straightforward. It's your mechanism for passing out information the same way your attributes and your properties are the way to pass in information. So let's cut to the lifecycle. And the lifecycle basically has two parts to it. One is the most basic lifecycle events that web components already offered. We've seen a bunch of these before in previous videos. Connected callback, that happens whenever your component gets created and attached to the DOM, like somebody made reference to your element in some HTML. Disconnected callback indicates that element went away, either from JavaScript or something else. Adopted callback you probably won't use a lot. It's basically for when your element goes from one document to another. And the attribute change callback, which usually you will not need to mess with for LitElement because it does a good job of handling all that and exposing it within its own lifecycle already. So you don't really have to do too much with that. Those are the four basic things that Web Components already has. You can override some of them if you need to. We did actually use disconnected callback in one of our previous videos because I needed it to shut down a timer whenever one of my components went away. This is the additional stuff, lifecycle stuff, that LitElement adds to the picture. So the first one is a function you're going to call under certain circumstances. So like if you add your own setters for your properties, then you will need to call request update, and it documents how you need to call that. If you're overriding how properties get set on your component, then LitElement might not know when to perform a render. Request update tells it, here's an opportunity where you might need to perform a render. And in fact, you can actually use it. Let's say you had some other thing happen. You made an API call, the API results returned, and for whatever reason, you need to manually request an update or request an update because a certain time has passed or the screen needs to be refreshed for some reason. Any of those cases, you can also just manually call request update. The rest of these are all lifecycle points in the LitElement lifecycle. You can override them if you need to change how LitElement handles something. So perform update, should update, update itself. All of those are opportunities for you to change how LitElement handles that particular thing. Render, you've seen it a bunch. That is, you're overriding LitElement's rendering with your own rendering. So you will almost always override render. But the rest of these, and actually unusually for these LitElement things, you do not need to call the default version of render with your own render. It's okay if you just override it, and because the default one doesn't actually do anything. So you just need to override render and make your own. First updated gives you an opportunity to do things like, oh, I've rendered the component now, but now I need to hook up some special watch for events or something like that. Any of those kinds of things, there's an opportunity there. Updated and updated complete. All of these tell you when certain things have happened within the overall life cycle of LitElement. You should know that these exist, but for the most part, other than render and request update, I doubt you're going to touch most of them very often. So don't worry too much about them, but it's good to know that they're there. So what have I not covered? Okay, we covered the big things, obviously. We covered properties and attributes, we covered templates, we covered events, and we covered lifecycle, but at a high level, admittedly. But I showed you a lot of examples, so hopefully you should have a better sense for how you would write one of these things yourself. What we haven't covered is the all-important shadow DOM and writing CSS for your components. That is a super important skill, but really it merits its own video. There's no way I can shoehorn it into this one, and I will be doing another one at some point. Another thing is turning off your shadow DOM. I think I've mentioned this previously, but just in case I haven't, let's say you're really fond of a certain framework. You like to use Bootstrap or Foundation or one of the other big Bulma or Material Design, one of the big off-the-shelf frameworks for CSS. If you really want to use that in your components, normally the shadow DOM actually prevents that, and LitElement turns on the shadow DOM for all your components by default. So that's normally a good thing because you're wanting to do your own CSS inside your components, and you don't want it to leak out into the outer world, and you don't want outer CSS to come in. But if you're planning to use a framework, you need that to leak in. Otherwise, when you try to render components that have Bootstrap styles and all these other things embedded in them, that CSS won't be able to penetrate into them from your outer page, and you would either have to load the exact same CSS from all of those elements, or you have to turn off the shadow DOM. Fortunately, turning it off is like a one-line thing, and it's covered well in the LitElement docs. You just need to know that you can do it if you need to, and it's on by default. I haven't covered testing your component. That, again, worthy of a video all on its own. Routing, I did cover it a little bit when I did one of my project videos, which I need to go back to project videos again. But when I do, if you want to go back, there's a project video that where I'm building the score pad. And in the first one, I do talk about routing some, and I actually make use of a library together with web components a little bit. State handling. Neither React nor LitElement dictates how you do state handling. It's entirely up to you. A lot of people use Redux with React. I've used Redux quite successfully with LitElement, and I've never had any problems. It worked great. But there are lots of other choices as well. That, again, probably worth a video all on its own. Redux is a fairly complicated thing by itself, and using it with your own custom web components is a whole other thing. And then last, and actually least, is polyfilling your custom elements and the shadow DOM so that your web components can work on IE11. I generally do not encourage supporting IE11 anymore. It's a bad idea. I think people should stop using it. It's a terrible browser, and it holds us back. However, with that said, if you have to support it, you can still use web components, because there are, if you've never heard the term polyfill before, basically what it means is there's a piece of JavaScript you can load in those browsers, and it will try to emulate the new features of custom elements and shadow DOM. That's what polyfilling is loading a piece of JavaScript on some browsers to imitate, to some extent, a feature that comes in later browsers. So for IE11, there are polyfills for both custom elements and shadow DOM, so that you can make your components work even in those browsers. I'm not going to cover that in a video. There is documentation on how to do it. It's not hard to find. I don't encourage the use of those, so I'm not going to really concern myself too much with it. But as you've seen here, there's probably 3 or 4 videos at least that I'm going to need to. Let's say 4 videos at least that I need to come back and do. So I look forward to doing that, and I hope you've enjoyed this series on web components, and specifically web components with LitElement. Thank you so much for listening again to As We May Think. I appreciate your viewership every single time, and if you enjoyed it, please click like and subscribe, as well as the notify bell that you see on your screen. That'll let you know whenever a new episode drops, which is normally Tuesdays and Thursdays. Again, thank you so much. Bye-bye.